Professor Snyder, can you say a few words about your decision to move to Canada? What was the rationale, and how does it feel to teach and write about the U.S. from Canada?
The rationale was that my family, for various reasons, thought it would be better to be in Canada. This was in the middle of the Biden administration, so it has nothing to do with Trump or with contemporary politics. I'm afraid it's both uninteresting and also essentially private. As for how it feels, it's useful to be in Canada. It's always useful to be abroad because it's always useful to cleanse yourself from American stereotypes about America. And the Canadians in particular have been much sharper and much quicker in their analysis of the Trump administration than the Americans have. In the US, you have to constantly deal with exceptionalism. You have to constantly worry about hurting other people's feelings. In America, people have a hard time making comparisons either with the past or with other countries. And from Canada, all that's relatively easy. If it's about how I feel morally, I mean, I spent much of the last year in the United States trying to prevent this from happening and then talking about the consequences. So, morally, I feel like my country's in a terrible situation, but I'm trying to do what I can.
Do you sense other academics might follow your path?
Oh, that's 100% certain. I mean, just as a sociological reality. And of course, the history of Greece shows this as well. In times of authoritarian regime change, people will feel persecuted, or they will simply feel like they could have a better life somewhere else. So there was a recent poll by Nature magazine, the top science magazine, which found that 75% of scientists in the United States would leave if given a good offer. That's a very bad sign for the United States, but not only in terms of our society, but also in terms of our power, if everyone wants to go. So, I mean, we can talk about people's individual decisions, but just as a sociological reality, yes, people are already trying to go. This is one thing, going back to your first question, that one does know about from Canada, because one hears from all the colleagues who would like to go.
You've spoken about pre-fascism in the US before. How close do you think the country is to institutional collapse or authoritarian drift today?
Yeah, that's an important question, and I appreciate the distinction you're making. Authoritarian drift certainly has already happened. I think the political scientists, the smart ones like Lucan Way and Zilblatt and Levitsky, who talk about competitive authoritarianism, I think that is already correct. I think we're already in a situation a bit like Hungary's or a bit like Poland's before 2023, where we will have elections, we will have political parties, but the elections will be unfair. And the question is, how do you win an unfair election? That can be done, but you have to know where you are. And so it's competitive in the sense that there are still elections, but it's authoritarianism in the sense that the executive is not obeying the law. The executive is trying to intimidate the judiciary. The executive is trying to intimidate the media and the universities and civil society and so on. I like your point about collapse, though, because I think that some kind of institutional breakdown is much more likely than a total authoritarian regime change. The United States, unlike, say, Greece or Hungary or Poland, is not. It's a very large country, more than 300 million people spread over a continent, with a very large number of power centers and a fairly robust federal system. And what this administration is doing is actually unlike authoritarian regime changes, recent ones in Europe, in that they are simultaneously making the regime more oppressive and more dysfunctional at the same time, and more or less explicitly. So at the same time that people have to be worried about being pulled off the streets, they also have to be worried about catching diseases. They have to worry about schools failing or roads breaking apart or bridges falling down or airplanes crashing. That's a weird combination. And I think that combination is more likely to lead to some kind of rift between parts of the country than it is to some sort of overall regime change.
What role do you think historical memory or the lack of it play in Americans' vulnerability to authoritarian rhetoric?
That's one more great question. I think it's always the case, pretty much always the case, that authoritarians talk about history as being only national, and they talk about the nation as being only innocent. And that is a particular play to our psychological vulnerabilities. We would like to think that we're the most important people and that we only do good things. Unfortunately, you can't have a democracy if that is your start, if those are your starting assumptions, because if you think you're always good and the past was flawless, you're going to listen to a leader who tells you those things over and over again. You also won't be able to cooperate with your fellow citizens, let alone with people in other countries. So the American sense that, you know, yesterday is always tomorrow, like the American sense that nothing really ever happened in the past and only the future matters, it really hurts us a lot. It hurts us a lot, partly because we don't see what can happen. We don't understand that this administration is taking advantage of our own historical weaknesses. It also means that we don't recognize who our allies might be or what democratic movements look like in our own history or in other people's histories. So I think you have your finger on something very important.
What paved the way to Trump in power? Was it inequalities? Was it the woke agenda? The anger towards the economic and political elite? Was it all of the above? What's your stance on that?
Well, not to be, you know, boring, but different people voted for Trump for different reasons. One of the reasons why Trump can win is that Biden did a very good job. The Biden administration was actually economically successful for almost everybody. And as a result, people could then have the thought, especially young people, that, oh, what could go wrong, right? So that's part of it. I think if the Biden administration had been catastrophic, it would have been harder for somebody like Trump. But in fact, the Biden administration was very normal. The second thing which is going on is that 2024 was a very hard year for incumbents all around the world, and Kamala Harris was seen as the incumbent. And Trump was seen as the challenger. That was probably unfair, but that's how it was. And one of the reasons why the world was hard on incumbents last year was the long after effects of COVID, where people are still angry, people still want some kind of return, they still have emotions that they want to see released. And then the other thing which helped Trump in 2024, as much as it did in 2016 or more, is disinformation and the internet. In the US, as in other countries, but more so, the internet is basically dominated by, unfortunately, dopamine-driven, essentially right-wing tropes and memes, and it creates the internet creates a kind of attention economy where somebody like Trump, who doesn't build things but destroys things and then laughs, that kind of politician fits the neurological patterns, unfortunately, which the internet is building. That helped him an awful lot in 2024. So, there you have it. I mean, it was a very close thing. He didn't even get half the vote, but you're right. There have to be explanations as to why he won.
Trump is now in war with academia in the U.S. and especially with Ivy League schools such as Harvard. How do you sense this policy might affect U.S. soft power and its ability to attract the world's best talent to its land, as it used to do for the last 100 years?
I really wish you were doing this interview in the U.S. because these are a series of fundamental questions, one after the other, and I really appreciate it. So, but I'm going to amend your question in a couple of ways. The first is that Harvard and the Ivy League are put in the center of this largely for show, because the Trump people want to pretend that they're going after some kind of an elite, whereas in fact, Trump and his party are going after the state universities as well. They're going after our public school system all across the country. And so what we see with the Ivy Leagues is the tip of the iceberg, and it's part of a general assault, not just on academia, but on education as such, and also, as you mentioned, on science as such. It's hard to think of any, even in the 1930s, the authoritarian regimes didn't go after their own education systems and their own science infrastructure the way that the Trump administration is doing. And this has implications for soft power. As you say, we know already that graduate students are declining admissions offers, that scientists are leaving the US, that a lot of talent is going to go to China or Europe that would have come here. But it's also a question of hard power. The United States economy and hence its military and financial power was built upon extraordinary investments in science beginning in about 1941. We're now reversing a trend, which is fundamentally what made the United States exceptional for the past 85 years.
Columbia University conceded to a series of demands from the Trump administration. Is that a route other schools should follow, or is that a dangerous path?
I think it was obviously a mistake because, first of all, Columbia didn't get anything out of it. they're in a worse position than other universities. Second, it sets a very bad precedent for other universities, but also would encourage the Trump administration to go after other universities. So no, I think it was a terrible path. There's also the problem that in making the concessions, Colombia is in some sense affirming the premise, and the premise is absurd. Like the idea that Colombia has to be punished because it's anti-Semitic. I mean, Colombia's student body is more than 20% Jewish. It was historically known as the Jewish Ivy. Much of its administration is Jewish. Certainly bad things happened in protests in Colombia. No point in disputing that. But the idea that Colombia should be punished because it's anti-Semitic is deliberately an absurd premise. The Trump administration people know that's absurd. And so when you make concessions on the basis of that premise, you're helping the Trump administration to trivialize anti-Semitism, which of course is a real and terrible problem in the world.
How do you sense this tariff war might end, and what could be its implications to our economies? Will it work, or do you sense that the world is too interconnected to end up in protectionism in the 21st century?
Yeah. I mean, I think you can make things worse with tariffs fundamentally, but you can't really make them better. I mean, the premise is that the United States will become stronger because of manufacturing. But of course, manufacturing primacy depends upon science primacy. And going back to your earlier question, we're giving that up. And so it doesn't, if you're going to have some kind of autarkic policy where you were going to create, a world economy in the borders of your own country, you would then be encouraging science and you'd be trying to steal everyone else's scientists as opposed to punishing them and sending them away. So for that fundamental reason, it doesn't really make sense. But also the replacing the supply chains is much more complex, I think, than somebody like Peter Navarro understands or Mr. Trump understands. I think that would be like a project for decades, and this is the second problem. These guys have no attention span. So like a project of building an autarkic, self-reliant economy, I don't think it makes any sense. But if you were going to do it, you would really have to bear down on the details. And these guys cannot bear down on the details. They just have no attention span. So I don't think it can work for the United States. And obviously it makes things harder in the world, but it makes everyone weaker except maybe China. It reduces the overall amount of prosperity in the world, but that doesn't benefit the United States in any sense.
Do you sense there is a clear U.S. strategy towards the Ukraine front? And are there any tools the West can use to mobilize Vladimir Putin towards a ceasefire?
Those two questions are related. I'll take the second one first. Of course there are tools. The European Union should seize Russian assets and give them to Ukraine. If they seize them, they should be given to Ukraine. There are $300 billion, which the Europeans could use to assist the Ukrainians to win this war and then to rebuild. The only argument against it is that this would challenge certain legal precedents. But if Russia wins the war, the legal precedents that will be overturned are a million times more significant. So precisely in order to stabilize Europe, those seized Russian assets should be turned over to Ukraine to win the war. The Europeans can also increase sanctions. They can also arm Ukraine. The Americans, of course, have policy instruments. But we are sort of trapped in this mental prison where we think all that matters is talking. And so American media coverage circles around what Trump says. But what he says doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is whether we use policy or not. The Biden administration actually had a policy towards Ukraine. It could have been more consistent. It could have been more ambitious, but they had a policy. All Trump does is talk. That's it. He just talks. And so the American policy instruments don't even get mentioned, but we have them. We could have secondary sanctions. We could have sanctions on Russian raw materials, and we could be arming Ukraine as we did under the Biden administration. We're choosing not to use those policies. If the Europeans and the Americans both acted, the Russians would have to make peace. It's as simple as that.
There's a clear division between the West now, right? The US and the EU.
We have a general problem, which is that Congress won't make policy without Trump, which is weird because normally a parliament should pass laws, right? But our parliament doesn't want to pass laws. It wants to wait and see what Trump does. Our Congress could pass sanctions. It could. It just hasn't done it. Yet. So it's more a matter of the person of President Trump, I think, being aligned more with, let's say, an Orban in Hungary or a Nawrocki now in Poland. It's more those people than the countries. But yeah, of course, I take your point. I mean, the British, the French, now the Germans and the Poles and other Europeans, especially the Balts and the Scandinavians, are doing more than the Americans. But more than that, they have a fundamentally clear understanding of what's going on. I mean, part of the problem with our people in the White House is that they don't believe that this war is Russia's fault. And they also believe that Russia must win because Russia's big, and kind of at that level of moral nihilism, but also strategic incompetence, it's very hard to formulate any kind of sensible policy. Personally, for 25 years, I've been trying to make the argument that Europe should be more strategically autonomous, not because I don't believe in transatlantic friendship, I do very much so, but because the Americans are unpredictable, and also because it's, I think, morally harmful for Europeans to be dependent upon Americans and to be in the habit when a crisis arrives to have to wait to see what the Americans are going to do. I think that's been bad for Europeans for decades, and I think it should end. But yes, I think this has been significant. It's been significant for Macron. I think it's been significant for others as well. And I think you do see, I mean, I wish it were more and faster, but I think you do see with respect to Ukraine, something like a common foreign policy among the more important European players and also the more ambitious Scandinavians and Balts.
If we could actually talk about Donald Trump's footprint on the American society as a whole, I mean, maybe his tenure ends in 2028, maybe not. No one knows and no one can predict how things will evolve. But what do you think is the most concrete footprint of his presence in the political life of the United States?
I think it has to do with the idea of sovereignty. That I think the people who run the United States right now don't understand what sovereignty is. And so when they look abroad, they don't understand why Canadians want to be Canadians, because they don't really understand what a state is. They don't understand why Ukrainians want to resist Russia, again, because they don't really understand what a state is or a nation is. And once you see that, you have to recognize where it comes from. And where it comes from is they don't understand why Americans would want to have an American state. They don't really get it. For them, America is just a grift. It's just a scam. It's just it's a source of rhetoric which allows them to manipulate people. But they fundamentally don't understand how a sovereign state functions. They don't understand that there have to be traditions and laws and compromises. They just don't get that. And so the footprint is that example that they've been teaching a whole generation of Americans that patriotism is stupid and that the laws are for idiots and no one should pay their taxes and it's every man for himself. I think that's probably the long-term consequence. And unfortunately, as you suggest in the question, it will take a long time to repair something like that.